In the 1970s, we began to see the beginning of entrenched rulers in the Middle East. Assad in Syria, Sheikh Zayed of the UAE, Gaddafi in Libya, Hassan II of Morocco, and many, many more. These rulers, or their descendants, would largely bring the Middle East into the 21st century. But the late 70s also marked a huge shift in those countries not mentioned, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, and even Saudi Arabia, all of which will have a complete change in government or experience an enormous event. We can, for instance, begin with Algeria, who had the most peaceful changeover of power. Boumediene had ruled since 1965, and he continued to support the PLO and rebels in Western Sahara, while also countering the expansion of Morocco and Libya. But he entered into a coma in late 1978, and he never appointed a vice president or successor. But now he was in a coma, the Revolutionary Council needed to choose a successor, and a couple men vied for power. For instance, there was Mohammad Salah Yahyaoui, who was a military strongman and was supported by the Soviet Union. He was determined to promote socialism and remain hostile to the West. But there was also Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who favoured liberalising the economy. To compromise, the council appointed the Minister of Defence, Chadli Benjedid, who would rule over the country for the next decade. However, elsewhere things were a lot less peaceful, like over in Afghanistan. There, Mohammad Douad Khan had already ousted the king in 1973 and proclaimed a new republic. But in doing so, he had opened the gates to other coup attempts, which happened in 73, 74, and 76. And in opening up this political sphere, factionalism quickly filled into the government once more. In this period in Kabul, two main parties were vying for power, the Parcham and the Khalq. They were both leftists like Douad Khan, but they disagreed over policies. The Parcham were primarily urban people who wanted a slower, more gradual move towards Leninism, while the Khalq were mainly tribal Pashtuns who believed in a mass movement from the countryside. In a way, their differences could be compared to that of the Soviet Union and Maoist China. The two sides were eventually forced together by international communist parties to form the PDPA, but really, hostilities remained. Douad Khan, on the other hand, was accepting Soviet aid, but ultimately he was more focused on keeping his country independent and even claiming Pashtun lands from Pakistan. So now he had control, he actually began to purge many of the leftists that had actually helped him come to power in the first place. Then, in 1978, Mir Akbar Khyber was killed. He was a member of the Parcham, and they quickly blamed the government and Khalq for his assassination. The Soviets were also blamed by some, but the government blamed Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He led a new movement within Afghanistan, albeit from exile in Pakistan. This was the Organization of Muslim Youth, an Islamist faction determined to end communist influence in his nation. Hekmatyar had studied in Kabul University under Burhanuddin Rabbani. Rabbani had already travelled to Egypt beforehand, and there, like many other Islamists, he studied the works of Sayyid Qutb. Qutb, much like the Muslim Brotherhood in the country, spoke against materialism, Western influence, and anything that they deemed to be un-Islamic. Well, Rabbani took these ideas back to Afghanistan, translated them, and taught them to Hekmatyar and another student named Ahmad Shah Massoud. Both students left Afghanistan to travel to Pakistan, where they were contacted by intelligence services. They all began to plan for a major uprising against Douad, with Massoud beginning it in Panjshir. He was, after all, an ethnic Tajik, and this region is majority Tajik. The rebellion began in 1975, but it failed and caused a major split between the two students. Hekmatyar would go on to lead a more radical group called Hezb-e-Islami, while Massoud would lead the more moderate Jaimat-e-Islami. Daoud Khan, though, now realised that he needed to repair relations with Pakistan to stop this happening in the future. To do so, he promised to finally stop funding militants across the border. But going back to Kabul, though, and the assassination of Mir Akbar Khyber. The Parcham, under the leadership of Babrak Kamal, continued to blame the government. When they protested, Dawood arrested many Parcham members and even Khalqists, like their leader, Nur Muhammad Taraki. It was during this period of turmoil that the communists, who had not yet been arrested, decided to make their move. They were led by Hafizullah Amin, a member of the Khalqists. He already had sympathizers within the army, including a tank commander. and this tank commander told the president a coup was expected and requested that tanks be brought into the capital to defend the palace. But these tanks just turned on Daoud inside. More communists arrived in the city, stormed the palace, and killed Daoud in the process. The coup leaders then announced, "For the first time in the history of Afghanistan, the last remnants of monarchy, tyranny, despotism, and power of the dynasty of the tyrant Nadir Khan has ended, and all powers of the states are in the hands of the people of Afghanistan." There doesn't seem to be any evidence that the Soviets actually had a role in this coup, but now Afghanistan was firmly under their influence, something that Russia had been trying to do ever since the Great Game. Initially, the government was divided between prominent leaders like Taraki and Kemal, but this wouldn't last. The Khalqists would quickly send Kemal over to Czechoslovakia, claiming that they discovered a plot against them. Now, Amin and Taraki were in charge, and they killed up to 50,000 opponents in the first year of their rule. In one radio announcement, they even proclaimed, "We need 1 million people to make the revolution. It doesn't matter what happens to the rest. We need the land, not the people." This brought in a new age of political repression, which Afghanistan had not really seen up until that point, as beforehand, centralized power was weak. But now, mass arrests, torture, and execution were pretty common. The Marxists also began to anger many of the tribes by confiscating their land, granting women more rights, and implementing many more of the usual reforms. However, it was the government's violence that angered people the most. The New York Times reported, "A 17-month reign of terror in which real or imagined opponents of the Afghan regime have been arrested, sometimes with wives and children, tortured and secretly executed. It's as bad as Idi Amin's Uganda," the European-educated Afghan said. "It's reached a point where you can't trust your own family." The soldiers of the new government looted homes, arrested clerics, and even encouraged mass assault of women. It was so bad that the Soviets condemned them, and it almost instantly resulted in a couple of rebellions. In Herat in March 1979, clerics criticized the new government and inspired the crowds to begin tearing down communist symbols. The communists then sent in troops to crush them, but this force was mainly made up of ethnic Tajiks, who just mutinied and joined in the rebellion. One of the soldiers involved was Ismail Khan, a member of Jamaat-e-Islami and an ally of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and he would later be the ruler of Herat. The rebels now had control of the city and killed anyone they suspected of being a communist. They even killed Soviet advisors and paraded their bodies through the city. Amin, however, had a plan. He sent troops to Herat waving green flags. The rebels believed that they were allies and welcomed them in, and of course, Amin's men then proceeded to kill thousands of people. Then, in Bala Hissar in August 1979, Maoist, Islamists and others joined forces to rebel against Taraki and Amin. Although they were swiftly bombed and crushed, all of this shocked Tarik, who believed he couldn't rely on his own army anymore, and therefore needed Soviet aid. But he also wrote to Brezhnev, "We must not leave the Pakistani Pashtun and Baluchi in the hands of the imperialists. Now it is possible to launch a national liberation struggle amongst these tribes, and include the Pashtun and Baluchi regimes in Afghanistan." Tariki was becoming a figure a bit like Kim Il-sung, referring to himself as the great leader and star of the East. He began to take power away from Amin and instead rely on the support of his Gang of Four incredibly loyal ministers. They began to suspect Amin was trying to make a move for power, so they plotted to assassinate him first. Tariki and his Gang of Four invited Amin to lunch and shot at him on arrival. Amin though managed to flee, and he called upon his allies within the army to join him and return to the palace. They overwhelmed Tariki, arrested him, and he soon died in prison. Most likely he was killed. Amin was now in full power, but even he wouldn't last very long. However, we need to leave Afghanistan there, as just across the border, possibly one of the greatest changes took place, the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Now, to set the stage for this, we maybe need to go back to 1963. The Shah then was in full power, and his white revolution was westernizing the nation. Women were given rights, education was made mandatory, and more. However, many clerics believed that this was a serious threat to Islam, including Imam Khomeini. He issued a declaration denouncing the reforms and the moral corruption of the country. For this, he was arrested, but that just prompted people to take to the streets. Even in Tehran, 100,000 people chanted, "Death to the dictator, God save you Khomeini," death to the bloodthirsty enemy. When the protests spread to other cities like Qom and Shiraz, the Shah imposed a curfew and sent out his secret police force, the Savak. In some instances, his soldiers opened fire on protesters with machine guns, killing hundreds. The government, however, didn't know what to do with Khomeini. Either they kill him or release him. The head of Savak supposedly stepped in to save his life, warning that his execution would lead to a revolution in the country. Khomeini, though, continued to speak against the Shah, and for this he was exiled to the Shia holy cities of Iraq, where he would stay for the next 15 years. A calm period then followed in Iran, and the Shah was able to build up his country's economy thanks to oil and gas revenues. As Time magazine reported in 1971, since 1962, Iran's gross national product has advanced at an average 9.2% per year to $10 billion in 1970. Per capita income has nearly doubled from $180 a year to $350. Drawing on oil income that has now reached $2 billion, the Shah has built modern roads, communication facilities and dams, though 2/3 of the country's 30 million people still live in villages. Tehran, the capital, has become a bustling city of 3 million, with traffic even scarier than Tokyo's. However, this was still a country filled with opponents to the Shah's rule, and not all of it came from the Islamists. Jalal al-Ahmad, for example, had been a communist initially, but he developed his own ideas, centered more on the rejection of Western ideas and technology. For instance, the Communist Tudor Party still existed, although it was very weakened. There were also those that wished to return to democracy, like that Iran had before Mossadegh had been removed from power. This cause was largely taken up by Mehdi Bazargan, who formed the Freedom Movement of Iran. All of these groups would continue to organize throughout the 1970s, while the people continued to grow more and more angry with the Shah. In 1971, for example, he celebrated the anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire. Royals and presidents from around the world attended. A huge tent city was built in the desert. 18 tons of food was shipped in from abroad, along with thousands of bottles of wine, hundreds of French chefs and more. Obviously, this was all incredibly expensive, and the whole affair made people angry. Meanwhile, the huge profits generated by the oil trade did have some negative impacts. For instance, inflation left many people destitute. The Shah did try to take steps to tackle inflation in 1977, but this included austerity measures, which of course angered even more people. Also, the Savak continued to arrest or kill many of the Shah's political opponents. For instance, it's believed that they had one Islamist assassinated over in England. This was Ali Shariati, who believed in a more revolutionary version of Shia Islam, one which would bring about a socialist nation. But in his view, this would be free of the bureaucracy of Marxism or the traditionalism of many of the Shia clerics. His supporters would form the People's Mujahideen, otherwise known as the MEK. His death or assassination just worsened the Shah's reputation, and then there were a number of other suspicious deaths which were immediately blamed on the Shah and Savak without any real proof. For instance, Khomeini's son died of a heart attack, and thousands took to the streets to mourn the loss. This, though, is something that we will see a lot. Even though the Shah may not be responsible for the death, he will just be blamed anyway. That is not to say that Savak wasn't cruel, though. As Time reported, the 5,000-member Iranian secret police force Savak has long been Iran's most hated and feared institution. With virtually unlimited powers to arrest and interrogate, Savak has tortured and murdered thousands of the Shah's opponents. However, within that same article, they interview a high-ranking member of Savak who says, "In January, demonstrators paraded a man who was blind and had lost his arms. They said Savak did this to him, and they called him a hero. In fact, he was a terrorist who lost his sight and was maimed when a bomb he was making exploded. If Savak had been responsible for his injuries, we could easily have just got rid of him. We would not have let him live as a document of torture." The Americans, meanwhile, were pressuring the Shah to liberalize his country just a little bit. However, the political prisoners that were released just met and began to plot once more. In January 1978, an article appeared in the papers denouncing Khomeini as a British agent. His followers again took to the streets in Qom because of this, but they were shot at to disperse. Anywhere between 5 and maybe even 300 people were killed. Now, according to Shia tradition, memorial services should be held 40 days after a person dies, and this is important. Because we will see people take to the streets to mourn the loss, they will maybe attack a few things that they deem to be Western, like cinemas and banks. The army will be called in and a few people are killed, but Khomeini will exaggerate these numbers and plan for more action 40 days later. The Shah would eventually make some more liberal reforms to end this wave of violence. He promised to relax censorship and even hold elections. Savak officials were also fired, more prisoners were released, the army were ordered not to use deadly force again, and to appease the Islamists, casinos and nightclubs were shut down. This seemed to work, as Shariat Madari, the Grand Ayatollah of Iran, even called on the people to organise a sit-in to mourn dead protesters, rather than take to the streets again. But then a series of events made the situation worse. To sort out the economy, cuts were made, which meant thousands of people lost their jobs. And in the summer of '78, oil workers went on strike, and even more protests broke out again. In August, arsonists set fire to a cinema with 400 people locked inside. Khomeini instantly blamed the Shah for this, and thousands began to protest again. Yet it was possibly Islamists that were responsible, because they had already been attacking cinemas before. Nevertheless, hundreds of thousands of people protested in Tehran, and the Shah had to declare martial law. But then, a few thousand people refused to obey the curfew and were fired upon. Khomeini again exaggerated the number of dead, and here's where the Shah made a pretty crucial mistake. He pressured the Iraqis to exile Khomeini, hoping that this will end his influence. But he found a new home in France, and received worldwide attention. There he also met Karim Sanjabi, the leader of the Democratic National Front, and they agreed to create a coalition in order to make Iran Islamic and democratic. Back in Iran, the protesters were now getting even more violent and better armed. In December 1978, over 2 million people marched in the capital during the Muharram protests. This number would grow to possibly over 6 million people, and it included Democrats, Islamists and communists. But some of the moderate forces were beginning to see that Khomeini was a bigger threat than the Shah, and they switched sides. For instance, Shapur Bakhtiar of the Socialist Iran Party broke from the demonstrations and was welcomed by the Shah as his new prime minister. Ideally, he would form a new coalition, but the protests continued, and in early 1979, the Shah realized he could do nothing and left the country, leaving Bakhtiar to settle the issue. Bakhtiar, though, just largely gave in. He freed all opponents and pulled the army back, and then, in February, invited Khomeini back to the country. While millions celebrated his return, Khomeini created his own government, appointing Mehdi Bazargan as his prime minister. He, as I mentioned before, was from the Democratic Freedom Party, so he would serve as a vehicle to unite all the opposition movements. Now, military units began to switch sides, as the Islamists and the Marxists took over weapons factories and revolutionaries stormed government buildings. Bakhtiar fled the palace, leaving Bazargan as the new leader of Iran. But it became clear that this moderate bloc of opposition really had little power. Khomeini and the Islamists formed a revolutionary council of religious leaders, supported by an armed wing of supporters known as the Revolutionary Guards. They formed local councils to police the state, and this new military force would attack anyone they deemed to be an enemy of the revolution. Some of the first to challenge the new government were the Arabs and Kurds in the West. The Arabs of Khuzestan, for instance, rose up in April 1979, demanding autonomy, but they were quickly met by Khomeini's forces. These rebels were led by the DRFLA, and they would achieve worldwide notoriety in 1980 when they changed tactics after their defeat. That April, some of their members arrived in London and stormed the Iranian embassy to take hostages. After a standoff that lasted a few days, the British government decided not to offer safe passage or even negotiate. Instead, SAS soldiers raided the building and killed 5 out of the 6 terrorists. Otherwise, the Kurds to the north of them also believed that this was a perfect opportunity to claim their independence. The Kurdish Democratic Party launched an insurrection in March 1979 and took over Sanadaj and nearby cities like Mahabad. Khomeini, though, would declare a jihad against them and launch a huge campaign. Backed by fighter jets and tanks, the government retook most of the cities, pushing the rebels into the mountains. From here, the Kurds would be able to take control over most of the roads leading into the cities, and for a while in 1980, they even moved back to Mahabad. Soon though, they would receive assistance from Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. but ultimately they would be crushed in 1983. Before coming on to the Iran-Iraq war though, I should mention how Khomeini was able to seize full power for himself in Tehran. Of course the war would help his popularity, but also the democratic groups at this point were divided over the future of the country. Some were fully aligned with Khomeini, but others, led by the likes of the Ayatollah Shariat Madari, favoured forming a more liberal state. Marxists meanwhile saw their position completely undermined, and some of them even joined with the rebels in Khuzestan and Kurdistan. To complicate matters though, many of the Marxist rebels were followers of Ali Shariati. This meant that they were both Islamists and Marxists, like the Forcan group. They deemed Khomeini to be a reactionary and assassinated a founder of the Revolutionary Council in 1979. But some Marxists still remained loyal to Khomeini, and a referendum was held which asked the people if they wanted Iran to become an Islamic republic. Some groups boycotted the vote, so the vote was very much in favour of Khomeini. Yet what an Islamic republic would actually be was never specified. The Communist Tudeh Party, Freedom Movement and more all supported the change, which created a new position in government, a guardian jurist, a religious leader who would make sure every law was sufficiently Islamic. This would become the supreme leader of Iran, a title Khomeini took for himself. They also agreed to hold elections for the parliament and president, but any laws they would pass needed to go through the supreme leader and a council of clerics. The supreme leader also had full control of the army, but Khomeini still didn't trust the military fully, so the Revolutionary Guard acted as a very loyal counterweight. This was a pretty smart move because in July 1980, members of the armed forces were already planning a coup. At the centre of it was Bakhtiar and a general named Bahram Ayana, who tried to unite the monarchists and seize power. And Ayana is notable because he was one of the few people that actually converted back to the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism. So of course, an Islamic revolution would not be good for him. There was some hope for this to work though, because they could have been helped by the Iraqis, but they were discovered and arrested, and for his part, Bakhtiar would later be assassinated in Paris. While all of this was happening, most of the world was left in shock over the turn of events. For starters, the previous strikes and now revolution in Iran had caused yet another huge spike in oil prices, which would force many nations to ration the resource. Otherwise, America feared that the Soviets may invade in order to defend the communists of Iran, so there was talk of America invading first. The Americans also allowed the exiled Shah into their country, which enraged the Iranians, who demanded that he be returned to stand trial. When this was rejected, Iranians stormed the American embassy in November and took the staff hostage for over a year. Khomeini largely supported the whole thing, saying, "This has united our people. Our opponents do not dare act against us. We can put the constitution to the people's vote without difficulty." But Prime Minister Bazargan denounced it and resigned, and this was followed by a wave of political parties being banned. Other opponents had also already been imprisoned or killed, like the moderate theologian Mahmoud Tani, who had warned against a return to despotism. There were some protests against Khomeini's actions, however he just encouraged his supporters to attack them, even saying that all of his opponents were not even human beings. Shariat Madari still remained as a figurehead of moderate democracy, but even he was placed under house arrest. So opposition to Khomeini's reforms still hadn't died out entirely. In January 1980, Abul Hassan Banisadr was elected as president, largely because no cleric could actually run for office. Initially he was seen to be an ally of Khomeini, but this wouldn't last long, as out in the streets, Khomeini would launch even more attacks on his opponents. He started a cultural revolution by declaring universities were training young Iranians to be agents of the West. Schools were closed, thousands of teachers were sacked, and the military was purged. Unveiled women were also barred from entering government buildings and in the workplace, and in a couple of years, veils would be mandatory for women everywhere. Banisadr spoke against some of these new laws, so he was just impeached and forced to flee, joining many other exiles in Paris. Meanwhile, again, remember by this point, the Iranians were now at war with Iraq. Iran was therefore desperate for money, but the Americans had frozen their assets ever since the hostage crisis. Ronald Reagan, though, was able to negotiate the release of these hostages in exchange for the release of some of their assets. They were released almost immediately after he took office in 1981, leading some to believe he actually helped delay the whole thing to gain a propaganda victory. Khomeini, though, already had defeated most of his domestic opponents, and now he turned on the Marxists, the followers of Ali Shariati, the MEK. A couple thousand of them had already been killed, so the MEK responded with a bombing campaign. The Hafti Tir bombing killed 70 high-ranking officials in June, and in August they bombed the Prime Minister's office, killing 8 people including the Prime Minister. This, however, turned the public against the MEK, and many of their members were either arrested or fled. The Communist Tudeh Party was now left alone. When many of them began to see the writing on the wall, they began to call for action. But their papers were closed down, 10,000 were arrested, and by 1983, the Islamists had seized full power. Meanwhile, over in Iraq, just a few months after the Shah left Iran, al-Bakr resigned as the leader after 11 years in power. He cited health reasons and handed control over to his number 2, Saddam Hussein. Hussein had already been leading much of Iraq's foreign policy for some time now. For instance, he made the decision to exile Khomeini after talk with the Iranians. Or when Tito visited Baghdad, he met with Saddam Hussein, not al-Bakr. Hussein also held a summit of Arab leaders in Baghdad in 1978, which was in response to Egypt making peace with Israel. Sadat and Egypt could no longer be seen as the centre of Arab unity. So while Gaddafi was trying to take over the cause in Libya, Saddam Hussein tried to do the same in Iraq. There were, though, further complications to Arab unity. Libya had fought Egypt, Morocco was fighting the Algerians, and the Syrians had troops in Lebanon to fight against the PLO. In the summit in Baghdad, however, Saddam Hussein shocked many by offering to send troops to help Syria in the event of war, and the leaders of both nations declared that they were one state, one party, and one people. While it is true both nations were under Ba'athist control, they had been rivals for many years by this point. But talks of unity only lasted a few months, and by early 1979, the two nations were enemies once again. It's not exactly clear what the motives were to the initial talks and eventual collapse, but it's assumed that Hussein realized that Assad of Syria would not accept a secondary role, or as long as Bakr was in power, Hussein would hold no important titles. Otherwise, ever since Khomeini took power in Iran, the Shia Muslims of Iraq, who formed the majority of the country, began to grow emboldened. There had been a growing political movement in their community for some time by this point, called the Islamic Dawah Party, which was founded in Najaf. However, just like in Lebanon, the Shia were often the poorest in society and kept out of the political picture. So again, much like in Lebanon, many Shia would go on to join Marxist groups. There was one Shia cleric though named Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, who wanted to pull people away from Marxism and towards Islamic values, and throughout the 1960s he was pretty successful. The government would pass a number of laws to target the new group, like shutting down their newspapers, and the Baathists would even kill 75 high-ranking members of the party and cancel their annual pilgrimage between the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala. They of course feared that this would be used as recruitment, especially because Khomeini himself was still in Najaf at that time. Al-Sadr would also be arrested and tortured in 1977, but protests forced the government to release him. Just 2 years later, when Khomeini took power in Iran, the Shia people called upon al-Sadr to become the Iraqi Ayatollah. The Shia again took to the streets for a few days, but here, unlike in Iran, they were quickly put down. It is around this time that al-Bakr was pushed out of power or just resigned. As soon as Saddam Hussein took over, he held a conference of party members, and there he revealed a plot against him which he had uncovered. Prominent Ba'athist Muyi Abdul Hussein Mashadi was brought out of prison and confessed that he had participated in it. Supposedly he had been working with the Syrians and many of the members in the hall. He then proceeded to read out the names of the other alleged conspirators who were arrested, and over 20 of them were executed. Now Saddam had full power, but it also severed his relations with Syria once and for all, even though they continued to deny any involvement in such a plot. Assad, though, was having troubles of his own. Not only were his troops fighting in Lebanon, but at home he was facing Islamist attacks. Partially, this could be blamed on their actions in Lebanon, which many Muslims condemned. But also, remember, most of Syria's upper command was made up of Alawites, and they continued to take more power for themselves. Starting in 1976, the country saw an increase in terrorist attacks, led by the Fighting Vanguard. This group was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, who believed jihad should be called against secular governments in the Arab world, and they began to target officials, teachers and bureaucrats. Then, because the Islamists had supporters in the army, they were able to massacre Alawite army cadets in the artillery school outside Aleppo in June 79. This massacre also sparked off violence across the country, as the Brotherhood declared a jihad on Assad. They managed to even kill a number of Ba'athist party members by either attacking them in their homes, setting off car bombs, or just shooting them in the streets. Assad, however, responded swiftly. He sent over 30,000 soldiers into Aleppo in 1980, moving to wipe out all the strongholds of the Islamists, and in the process, they killed thousands of people. The Brotherhood, though, were very nearly able to kill Assad himself in June 1980, when they threw grenades and fired at him. In retaliation to this, however, the government executed 1,000 Brotherhood members, who were all killed in Palmyra prison. The last real action of this Islamist insurgency came in Hama in 1982. Government troops were ambushed and the imams in their mosques called out for jihad against the Ba'athists. Assad responded again with force, sending over 12,000 soldiers to lay siege to the city and then shell it to root out the Islamists. In doing so, it's estimated around 20,000 people were killed and 2/3 of Hama was destroyed. But he had largely ended the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. Assad had largely crushed this opposition alongside his militias, like the so-called struggle companies that were loyal only to him. But his rule wasn't necessarily safe. Just the next year he had health problems and appointed a small council to rule in his place. However, clearly sensing action could be taken against him in this moment of weakness, he only appointed Sunni Muslims, who largely wielded no power in the army. This worried the military command, who were predominantly Alawite, and also his brother, Rafat Assad. He had played a prominent role in the party for years now alongside his brother, and many people have accused Rafat of being behind the massacres at Hama, and a great deal of torture in prisons. But in March 1984 he marched on Damascus with thousands of men in tanks. They surrounded the city and forced Hafez to leave his house and meet with Rafat. As reported, at Rafat's home in Meza, the brothers were at last face to face. "You want to overthrow the regime?" Assad asked. "Here I am the regime." For an hour they stormed at each other, but in his role as elder brother and with his mother in the house, Assad could not fail to win the contest. Rafat therefore surrendered, but the problem was now that Hafez could not really execute him afterwards. Since coming into power, the Assads had taken over many positions of power, or married into families that had done. For instance, both brothers had married into the Makhlouf family, which was remarkably wealthy, and they held powerful positions like the head of the Republican Guard. Any major action could therefore split cousins against cousins, and in essence, the whole thing had become a feudal state. This was also very apparent with the Shabiha. These were Alawite gangs created to smuggle in goods across the borders. The Assads didn't persecute them, instead they transformed them into something like a paramilitary, one which could freely engage in criminal activities in return for killing people on the behalf of Assad. Some of them, however, were loyal to Rafat, so Hafez, fearing a civil war, just sent off his brother to Russia. Otherwise, religious uprisings sparked up again in Iraq, headed by the Shia and al-Sadr. After the Islamic Revolution, he was arrested again, and the government tried to get him to publicly denounce Khomeini's revolution. Sadr, however, refused, saying, "The only thing I have sought in my life is to make the establishment of an Islamic government on earth possible. Since it has been formed in Iran under the leadership of Imam Khomeini, it makes no difference to me whether I am alive or dead, because the dream I wanted to attain and the hope I wanted to achieve have come true thanks to God." The members of his party, though, began to grow more violent as they demanded he be released. They even came close to assassinating Tariq Aziz, a high-ranking member of the Ba'athist Party, and he, by the way, is somewhat of an interesting case. The Ba'athist Party under al-Bakr, now Saddam, was primarily a party around a small tribe, Al-Bu Nasir. Many of the high-ranking officials, like Chemical Ali, came from this tribe, which lives around Tikrit. Aziz, though, was a Christian from the north. Anyway, Saddam called for revenge against the Shia and arrested thousands. Sadr and his sister were taken into cells and tortured. In some stories, his sister was even assaulted in front of him, and then a nail was hammered into Sadr's head. Khomeini called on the Shia of Iraq to overthrow the Ba'athists afterwards, but for now, Saddam had managed to suppress the Shia uprisings. Iran and Iraq would go to war shortly afterwards, but before I get onto those wars, I need to mention yet another Islamist threat, one surprisingly in Saudi Arabia. It began with a man named Juhayman al-Otaibi, who wanted to revive the religion, bringing it back to its roots. He came from a noble family, part of the elite of Najd. His grandfather, for instance, had joined Ibn Saud in the Unification Wars. However, his grandfather, Sultan bin Bajad, would grow angry with Ibn Saud. Sultan, for instance, wanted to launch raids into Iraq and Jordan, but Ibn Saud prevented this. Then the king entered into negotiations with Britain, something Sultan deemed to be sinful, so he rebelled. This rebellion was crushed, but it seems that his grandson was now following in his footsteps. Juhayman also saw the House of Saud as acting sinfully because they allowed foreigners into the country and also were westernizing somewhat. In 1977 he was arrested for protesting against the government, and in prison he met Muhammad Abdullah al-Qahtani. Qahtani claimed that he had visions from God, which proclaimed him to be the redeemer of Islam, or the Mahdi. It was, in their eyes at least, up to them to kick the House of Saud out of the country and prepare the world for the coming apocalypse. They planned on taking over Mecca on the 20th of November 1969, or New Year's Day 1400 on the Islamic calendar. In the meantime, they gathered supporters and began to smuggle weapons into the Grand Mosque, hiding them in underground rooms. On the morning of the attack, the group attended morning prayers, hiding their weapons under their clothes. They then chained the gates to the mosque shut and trapped 50,000 people inside. From the loudspeakers they announced, "Fellow Muslims, we announce today the coming of the Mahdi, who shall reign with justice and fairness on earth after it has been filled with injustice and oppression. Countless visions have testified to the coming of the Mahdi." Many of the Saudi royals were abroad, so their response was slow, but really they faced a major problem. There was renovation being done, and any large explosion could have caused the ground under the Kaaba to give way. Plus, violence in the Grand Mosque was forbidden, so the army had to wait for Islamic clerics to give them permission. Internationally, the Americans blamed the newly installed Islamic Republic of Iran, while the Iranians blamed the Americans and Zionists for the attack. This in fact sparked off huge anti-American demonstrations in Turkey, Bangladesh, and the UAE. In Pakistan and Libya, they even attacked the American embassies and burnt them to the ground. Finally, after losing some men in small-scale assaults, on the 23rd a fatwa was issued from the clerics, giving the army permission for a full-scale attack. Anti-tank guided missiles shot at the rebels in the minaret, while many died in hand-to-hand fighting in the courtyards of the mosque, including the Mahdi. As the mosque filled up with corpses, the rebels retreated into the labyrinths underground, where they held out for a few days. The Saudis here decided to approach the French for help, who sent in the GIGN. This elite force had only been created after the Munich massacre, and now they were in Mecca, a town which Muslims were only allowed into. There are therefore two stories around how the French were actually involved here. One says that the French just trained the Saudis outside the city and devised their plan, while others say that they had to convert to Islam before moving in. Whatever the case, they drilled holes into the basements and gassed the rebels out. This, however, also killed a number of the hostages as well. Juhayman, along with 60 of his followers, were captured and publicly executed. Among the executed were 41 Saudis, 10 Egyptians, 7 Yemenis, 3 Kuwaitis, an Iraqi, and a Sudanese man. Plus, there were also allegedly 2 African Americans, whose names have been kept from the public. Strangely though, Juhayman could maybe be seen the winner in all of this. This is because immediately afterwards, the Saudi royals became far more conservative, hoping to end any further religious uprisings. They banned women from TV and gender segregated nearly all parts of society. They closed cinemas, music shops, and stopped teaching many non-Islamic classes at schools. And, crucially, a young bin Laden witnessed the tanks going into the holy city to crush the rebellion. He condemned the Saudi government for their actions in desecrating the mosque, and he would continue being an enemy of the House of Saud. In fact, he would soon travel to Pakistan and then on to Afghanistan, where he would fight against the Soviets. The leadership of the Middle East had now completely changed once again. And once again, war would soon follow. Iraq and Iran would go to war shortly after Saddam's execution, and the Soviets would invade Afghanistan before that. 1979 to the Americans was therefore a year of disaster. Carter's national security advisor even coined the term the Crescent of Crisis, to refer to all of the problem areas from Vietnam to Somalia, centered of course in Iran. As Time reported, the crisis area is vast. It includes India, once again the world's most populous democracy, but a politically divided and troubled nation with a squabbling, ineffective government. Impoverished Bangladesh, unstable Pakistan, where an inept military regime is currently considering the execution of deposed Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. To the northeast is Afghanistan, where a pro-Soviet junta that seized power last year is trying to rule over the world's most ungovernable tribal societies. To the west is Turkey, torn by religious unrest and social instability, to the point that martial law had to be declared in 13 provinces 2 weeks ago. Directly south of Iran, across the Persian Gulf, is Saudi Arabia, whose traditional monarchic system remains intact, but which is nevertheless highly vulnerable. Egypt, kept from bankruptcy by infusions of cash from Saudi Arabia, faces urban unrest and overpopulation. A moderate regime in Sudan to the south has barely survived 2 attempted coups inspired by radical Libya. On Saudi Arabia's southern flank lies the pro-Soviet South Yemen, whose radical government has been fomenting guerrilla warfare in neighbouring Oman. Across the Red Sea in the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopian junta of Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam is being held together by Soviet military aid and the presence of some 17,000 Cuban soldiers. They would go on to include many more nations and regions in this list. However, I'll skip ahead just slightly to 1980, when the Americans were given a lifeline. This is because Turkey would move firmly away from both communism and Islamism. On the streets, right-wing groups like the Grey Wolves had been clashing with the communists for years now. There was also a growing Kurdish movement led by the newly formed PKK. But in Ankara, there had been no strong leader, or even a party for a while. From 1977 to 79, Demirel and Ecevit had swapped power 4 times. During the same time, inflation was now in the triple digits, and unemployment was pushing more people towards more radical groups. There was also another issue growing overseas, the Armenian Secret Army. This group was not created in Armenia, but rather among the many emigres living in the Middle East. Their founder, Hagop Hagopian, was born in Mosul in Iraq, and spent his youth with Palestinian fighters. He began to emulate their tactics and organised a series of attacks across the world, hitting Turkish people and businesses. For instance, in 1983, they would bomb the check-in desk of a Turkish airline flight at Paris airport. So the Turkish army again looked to launch a coup to restore order, and on paper, return to Kemalist principles. However, the leaders of the coup, like Kenan Evren, were once again American-trained. He, like so many on the right, had been part of Operation Gladio, a force created to operate behind enemy lines if the Soviets were ever to invade. They would go on to join counter-guerrilla, which rounded up and tortured said communists. But how much America was actually involved in this coup is once again debated. Evren recruited other generals to create a National Security Council, and this included the leadership of every branch of the military. So really, the civilian government had no chance. In September 1980, they announced a coup had occurred over the radio and imposed martial law. Unable to fight back, the civilian rulers accepted the suspension of parliament, and now Turkey was under military rule. Strikes and trade unions were banned, curfews were imposed, and anyone deemed to be a political opponent was arrested and tortured. The numbers of how many were arrested in the first couple years is hard to know exactly, but we know 230,000 people were brought to trial. Over 1 million others were placed on a blacklist and monitored, and even the old political leaders were put in prison for a while. This would include Ecevit, Demirel, Erbakan, the leader of the Islamists, and even Turkez, the leader of the Grey Wolves. Turkez is a particularly strange one, as the counter-guerrillas in the Grey Wolves had been allies for some time now, but they had over 200,000 members and could be seen as a threat to the military government. So they too were banned for being a criminal organisation and accused of being involved in the drug trade. Evren also changed the constitution to stop any further instability and took the title of president for himself. He then held elections to decide the new prime minister in 1983, and this was won by Turgut Özal. He was part Kurdish and the son of an imam, and a former member of the Islamist Salvation Party. However, as all other political parties were banned, he created his own party called the Motherland Party. This pushed Islamic values culturally, but economically they were remarkably Western. He brought Turkey away from state planning and socialism and into the free market. and because of this, there was a bit of an economic boom. As foreign investment in the country increased, the government could look to work on infrastructure projects like the Ataturk Dam. Also, in order to quell further separatism, the government renamed thousands of places in Turkey in order to Turkify them. This had been a process going back decades, replacing the Armenian, Kurdish or Greek names of cities and towns to new Turkish ones. But the military government went even further and began renaming hills, rivers and more. The Turkish communist threat had therefore ended, and America had a secure ally in the region once more. But then, at the other side of the Islamic world, the Soviets made the disastrous decision to invade Afghanistan. The reasons behind it, though, are a little murky. In Kabul, the Soviets had a firm ally in President Amin. He had already deposed Taraki, and in public at least, he fully supported the Soviet Union. The Russians, on the other hand, had been ignoring their calls to send in troops to help crush rebellions which were largely caused by the brutality of the regime. For instance, in the summer of 1979, the communists arrested many leaders of the Shia Hazara community. When the people took to the streets of Kabul to protest, they were fired at, not just with rifles, but also tanks and helicopters. This, the Chindawal uprising, therefore ended with thousands more casualties. Still though, the Soviets didn't get involved here, but they would less than a year later. Maybe they now feared Iran's Islamic Revolution would spread east, or, as the KGB claimed, a man was secretly pro-Western, although this has been revealed to be a fabricated story. Whatever the case, it was enough to convince the likes of Andropov, who would soon take over the Soviet Union. He at first didn't support the war, but then began to talk of a CIA plot to use Amin to create, in his words, a new Ottoman Empire that ruled over Central Asia. There was also the military dictatorship of Muhammad Zia al-Haq across the border in Pakistan. He was very pro-Western and could maybe have funded rebels in Afghanistan against the communists. Or so too could the Chinese, who would look to take control of the communist powers for themselves. Maybe again the Soviets were just opposed to Amin's cruel methods of maintaining power. This may not have been for moral reasons, but because he was driving more and more people to join the opposition. So, whatever the case, Brezhnev decided to take Kabul and install a new leader in its place. Late in December, working with allies in the armed forces, they cut communication lines to the capital, and hundreds of Soviet airborne forces landed. They were strangely dressed initially in Afghan uniforms, although it was apparent to most that these were Russian soldiers invading a country that they were supposed to be allied with. They launched an attack on Tajbek Palace where Amin was hiding and installed Babrak Kemal as the new leader of the country. He had previously been in control of the more moderate faction of leftists known as the Parcham, but now he had very few allies in Afghanistan. The other leftists, the Khalqists, were now his enemies, many of his old allies had been purged, and outside the capital, the Islamists were free to rise up in the chaos. The Americans, the UN and most Muslim nations all condemned the Soviets for this action, and many boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. Even the Chinese joined in to claim that this was a threat to their own security. This all meant that any resistance groups could get a great deal of aid from Libya, Egypt, Pakistan, China, America and others. This, however, along with the Iranian Revolution, marked yet another shift in the Cold War. Just a few months earlier, Egypt and Israel had formalized their peace treaty, swinging the balance of power in the Middle East towards America, but now with the Iranian invasion and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it had potentially swung back to the Soviets. Thousands of Russian troops then crossed the border to aid Kemal and stop any rebellion. They took over the major roads and military installations, forming almost a ring of control. However, their presence had the opposite effect of what they desired. Many in the Afghan army mutinied and joined the opposition groups across the country. In January 1980, the first Soviet soldiers were assassinated in the streets of Kabul. The next month there was the 3 Hut uprising, but here we can't be sure who was organising it, if anyone at all. Thousands of people were protesting Soviet occupation, and in response to this, the Soviets and their Afghan allies killed hundreds of people. They put much of the blame at the feet of Maoist groups and had their leader executed. But they also blamed the Pakistanis and Americans as well. However, we can probably say that most of the people there were probably there on their own accord. A couple months later, students would again protest and again be fired at, and a dozen were killed. One girl in particular became a symbol of resistance, Nahid Saeed. She was killed after she condemned Afghan troops for supporting Russians over their fellow Afghans. There would then be further demonstrations in May, again that turned violent. In one case, the students even lynched a communist principal, and then the next month, there were stories of hundreds of students being poisoned in their schools, probably by the communists. Outside of the capital, the Soviets only ever held the Ring Road, as most of the countryside and small towns fell into the hands of the opposition. Often this is just summed up as the Mujahideen and then linked with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, but this is far from the case. For starters, the many groups were split between Sunni, later known as the Peshawar 7, and Shia, later known as the Tehran 8. And just to run through some of the major groups and leaders, Saeed Ali Beheshti led the Shia Hazara in a rebellion and took over a great chunk of central Afghanistan. Sibgadullah Mojadedi was the first to proclaim a jihad against the Soviets, and he took over Kunar. Ahmad Shah Massoud led mainly Tajiks in his group, Jaimat-e-Islami, and he took over the north. His old ally Gulbuddin took lands in the east, near the Pakistan border. But his group Hezb-e Islami suffered from yet another division, as Muhammad Yunus Khalis formed his own faction and took over lands nearby. The reasons behind this split have been disputed, ranging from Gulbuddin's inaction in previous revolts, or a lack of a plan for any leadership afterwards. It was in Khalis's faction that you could find many future leaders of the Taliban, like Jalaluddin Haqqani and later on Mullah Omar. Another group which also included some future Taliban members was led by Muhammad Nabi Mohammadi. This group was based in Kandahar in the south, and according to one journalist, the only party fighting the Soviets was the Harakat-e-Inqilab-e-Islami. The others were all fighting each other. Many of these men came from religious schools, and in the case of Nabi Mohammadi, he had actually served in parliament before. However, ethnic and tribal divisions caused them to clash with one another more than the Soviets. The worst for it, it has been said, is Gulbuddin's faction. These groups also never really had much of a political goal, except some form of nationalism and traditionalism. But there were still some who had a bigger goal in mind. Of course, there were still Maoists in the country, but among the Mujahideen, there was a Shia leader, Abdul Ali Mazari. He initially believed in federation and some calls for unity, but of course, this wouldn't happen. Otherwise, over in Pakistan, Arabs began to arrive to aid the rebels, notably bin Laden. He was from an incredibly wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, one which made their money in construction. But bin Laden began again to study the works of Sayyid Qutb, and taking on a pan-Islamist philosophy, he travelled out to help. Although it is believed that the Americans largely funded bin Laden, one journalist wrote, he did not receive any direct funding or training from the US during the 1980s, nor did his followers. The Afghan Mujahideen via Pakistan's ISI intelligence agency received large amounts of both. Some bled to the Arabs fighting the Soviets, but nothing significant. Early on, the small number of Arabs which arrived to help were largely led by Abdullah Yusuf Azam, a Jordanian religious scholar who proclaimed a jihad against the Soviets. He would largely use bin Laden's funds and also support from the Pakistanis to set up training camps, ready to send Arab volunteers into the country. However, these Arabs would only play a major part in the war later on, if at all. Instead, in these early years, the rebels spent most of their time blowing up radio towers, cinemas, hotels and the likes. The Soviets, on the other hand, didn't really have much of a plan for such a campaign. As one Soviet defector said, "Afghanistan is our Vietnam. We began by simply backing a friendly regime. Slowly, we got more deeply involved. Now, we are bogged down in a war we cannot win and cannot abandon."